3 days. That's all it took for one little steel valve to turn a neighborhood full of multi-million-dollar dream homes into giant walk-in freezers. I didn't smash anything. I didn't threaten anybody. And I sure didn't break the law. I simply stopped giving away something that had never belonged to them in the first place. My name's Ethan Cole. I'm 34 years old, and I make my living rebuilding heavy equipment engines outside Sheridan, Wyoming. Nothing glamorous about it. My hands always smell like diesel fuel. Grease gets under my fingernails no matter how hard I scrub. And if you walk into my garage, you'll probably wrinkle your nose from the mix of motor oil, welding smoke, and old pine lumber that's soaked up 30 years of hard work. My grandfather built that garage before I was born. He always said a man could tell who he really was by looking at the place where he worked, not the place where he slept. That's probably why I never cared much that my little weathered farmhouse looked completely out of place surrounded by million-dollar houses. It wasn't always like that. When Grandpa bought these 8 acres back in the late 70s, there wasn't much around except cattle, sagebrush, and rolling hills that turned gold every evening when the sun dropped behind the mountains. We'd fish the creek, fix tractors together, and spend entire Saturdays repairing fences. Back then, nobody imagined luxury developments would someday wrap around this property like somebody building a fancy picture frame around an old family photograph. But that's exactly what happened. About 6 years ago, developers came in with deep pockets and bigger promises. They bought nearly everything except our land. One ranch after another disappeared under bulldozers until paved roads replaced dirt trails, decorative streetlights replaced cottonwoods, and massive homes with heated driveways started popping up faster than I could keep track of. Every house looked like it belonged on the cover of some architecture magazine. Stone entryways, walls of glass, outdoor fireplaces, infinity pools. The kind of places where people worried more about matching patio furniture than whether their truck would start on a cold morning. I wasn't part of their homeowners association, never wanted to be, and honestly, they never acted like they wanted me around either. Their security guard barely nodded whenever I drove past the entrance in my old diesel pickup. Folks walking their designer dogs would glance toward my place the same way people look at an abandoned barn they think somebody forgot to tear down. Didn't bother me. My grandfather taught me that if somebody judges you by your fence instead of your handshake, you're probably talking to the wrong person anyway. Still, there was always this quiet tension. Developers had tried buying my land more than once. The offers kept getting bigger every year. One representative actually told me, "You could retire tomorrow if you'd just be reasonable." I smiled and told him my grandfather didn't leave me this place so someone else could erase it from a map. After that, they mostly left me alone, or at least I thought they did. Then came one bitter January morning. The kind where every breath hangs in the air like smoke and frozen grass crunches under your boots. I was walking my fence line after a windstorm, checking for broken posts the way I'd done hundreds of times before, when something caught my eye. Fresh dirt. In January. That doesn't happen naturally in Wyoming. Snow had been pushed aside, frozen ground had been dug up, and there was a trench running across the edge of my pasture. At first I figured maybe a utility company had made some kind of mistake, but the deeper I looked, the less that explanation made sense. Sitting inside that trench was a heavy steel pipeline, brand new, 6 inches across, disappearing beneath my property before heading toward the luxury subdivision next door. Nobody had called me. Nobody had knocked on my door. Nobody had asked permission. I stood there staring at it longer than I'd like to admit, trying to convince myself there had to be paperwork somewhere that I'd simply forgotten about. So instead of getting angry, I got curious. I followed that pipeline across nearly 200 yards until it vanished beneath a concrete utility building that powered the neighborhood's central heating system. The building hummed steadily despite the freezing air outside, and for just a second I wondered if maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the county had approved something years ago. Maybe Grandpa had signed an easement I never knew existed. I wanted to believe there was a simple explanation because the alternative meant somebody had crossed a line that couldn't easily be uncrossed. The next morning I drove into the county records office. Miss Eleanor had worked behind that counter longer than I'd been alive, and she recognized my last name before I even finished introducing myself. "Looking into your grandfather's property again?" she asked with a smile. I nodded and explained what I'd found. Her smile faded. 2 hours later we were surrounded by faded survey maps, deed books, mineral records, and yellowed paperwork that still smelled faintly like old paper and dust. Then she slid one document toward me and tapped a paragraph highlighted decades earlier. Mineral rights reserved by owner. Natural gas extraction rights included in perpetuity. I remember reading it 3 times because it didn't seem real. Grandpa hadn't just bought farmland. He'd bought everything underneath it too. Every legal right. Every underground resource. Every drop of natural gas resting beneath those 8 acres. My stomach tightened as another clerk searched easement records dating back nearly 50 years. Nothing. No lease. No right-of-way. No access agreement. No permit authorizing a pipeline across my land. Nothing. The room suddenly felt much quieter than before. Miss Eleanor looked at me over the top of her glasses and softly said, "Ethan, if that line is carrying gas from under your property, somebody made a very expensive decision without asking the one person they needed permission from." I folded the paperwork carefully, thanked her, and drove home in complete silence. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't thinking about money. I kept hearing my grandfather's voice echoing in the back of my mind. Never let somebody convince you that what's yours belongs to them just because they have a bigger house. Standing beside that pipeline again as the afternoon sun dropped behind the hills, I finally understood exactly what he meant. And I had a feeling the people living behind those beautiful stone gates were about to learn the same lesson. The drive home gave me too much time to think. Every mile I kept asking myself the same question. Was this just somebody's paperwork mistake, or had someone actually decided my property rights didn't matter because my little farmhouse happened to sit next to a neighborhood full of expensive homes? By the time I pulled into my gravel driveway, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger makes people careless. What I felt instead was something quieter: disappointment. Grandpa used to say the law works best when the facts are cleaner than your emotions. So before I spoke to a single person from that subdivision, I decided every claim I made would be backed by evidence. The following Monday, I hired a licensed land surveyor named Carl Benson. Carl wasn't much for conversation, but he could read a property map the way most people read a newspaper. We spent nearly 6 hours walking the fence line, locating monuments that had been buried for decades, comparing GPS coordinates with county plats, and tracing the pipeline from the edge of my pasture toward the mechanical building inside the subdivision. Every measurement matched the records. The line crossed onto my property without a recorded easement. Carl finally looked up from his tablet and said, "I've seen bad paperwork before. I've never seen missing paperwork this important." That afternoon, I called an attorney who specialized in mineral rights. Her name was Laura Whitfield, and unlike the television lawyers who make speeches every 5 minutes, Laura mostly listened. She read every document twice, asked careful questions, and never once promised an easy outcome. Finally, she closed the file and leaned back in her chair. "If everything you've shown me is accurate," she said, "this isn't just a property dispute. It's potentially unauthorized use of privately owned mineral resources. We don't rush this. We document everything." For the next 2 weeks, that's exactly what we did. Engineers inspected the line. Historical aerial photographs were collected. Utility records were requested. The county confirmed they had never issued an easement across my land. Even more surprising, the development's original construction plans described an alternate energy source, but nowhere did they identify the legal authority for accessing the underground gas beneath my acreage. Somewhere along the way, someone had apparently assumed nobody would ever ask the question. They assumed wrong. Word traveled faster than I expected. Before long, I noticed unfamiliar vehicles slowing down outside my gate. A few residents from the subdivision stopped to ask polite questions. Most honestly had no idea where their neighborhood's heating system came from. One older gentleman introduced himself as Frank and apologized before he even reached my porch. "If somebody crossed a line," he said, "the homeowners deserve to know the truth. Most of us bought our houses years after all this was built." That conversation stuck with me. It reminded me that a homeowners association board and the families living there weren't necessarily the same thing. Some people had simply trusted the wrong leadership. Laura agreed. "Don't make enemies out of people who might become witnesses," she told me. So instead of making public accusations, we sent one carefully written notice to the association's board requesting documentation supporting the pipeline's existence. 10 business days passed without a response. Then another letter arrived, not with documents, but with vague statements insisting the system had operated for years and therefore any concerns were administrative. Laura smiled when she finished reading it. "That's not evidence," she said. "That's avoidance. We filed for a declaratory judgment asking the court to determine ownership rights and requested immediate preservation of all construction records. Within days, contractors, engineers, and former project managers started receiving legal notices instructing them not to destroy documents. That's when the atmosphere changed. Suddenly, phones started ringing. One former subcontractor remembered being told to keep digging after asking whether an easement had been finalized. Another admitted he'd assumed the paperwork existed because nobody ever suggested otherwise. Piece by piece, the story became clearer. Whether through negligence or deliberate shortcut, decisions had been made years earlier without securing the permissions the law required. A week later, the association president finally asked for a meeting. We met in a neutral conference room at the county administration building instead of anybody's office. She arrived with 2 attorneys and an engineering consultant. Laura and I brought survey maps, deeds, inspection reports, and a timeline assembled from public records. The meeting stayed civil for nearly an hour. Then one of their attorneys quietly admitted they still hadn't located a recorded easement. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The silence said more than another argument ever could. The association president rubbed her forehead and finally asked, "What exactly are you looking for?" Laura answered before I could. "Recognition of Mr. Cole's property rights, compensation for past unauthorized use if appropriate, and a lawful agreement going forward that protects everyone involved." Nobody raised their voice. Nobody pounded the table. Real negotiations rarely look like television. They're slower, heavier, because everyone in the room understands expensive mistakes are finally catching up with them. As we walked toward the parking lot afterward, Laura looked over at me and said, "This isn't about winning an argument anymore. It's about deciding how costly the truth becomes." I watched the sun sink behind the same hills my grandfather loved, realizing the next conversation might determine not only the future of my family's land, but the future of an entire neighborhood that had been built on assumptions instead of permission. And for the first time since I found that pipeline, I knew we were finally getting close to the answer. By the time we sat down for the final round of negotiations, the atmosphere had completely changed. The confidence I'd seen on the board's faces during that first meeting was gone. In its place was exhaustion. Their attorneys had spent weeks digging through old files, interviewing contractors, and reviewing engineering records, and every new document pointed in the same direction. Somewhere years earlier, someone had decided it would be easier to move forward first and worry about permission later. That decision had finally caught up with them. What surprised me most wasn't the legal strategy or the paperwork. It was the homeowners themselves. Several of them reached out after learning what had happened. A retired schoolteacher stopped by one afternoon with homemade cookies and quietly said, "I don't think anybody living here wanted to benefit from something that wasn't ours." A young couple told me they'd emptied most of their savings just to buy their first home and had no idea there was a property dispute hidden beneath the neighborhood. Hearing those conversations reminded me that justice isn't about humiliating people. It's about fixing what was broken and making sure it stays fixed. The final agreement reflected exactly that. The association acknowledged my family's ownership of the mineral rights beneath my land and recognized that any future use required my written authorization. We negotiated a long-term easement with fair compensation, annual adjustments, independent inspections, and strict maintenance requirements. Every inspection report would be shared with both sides, and every future board would be bound by the same agreement. Just as important, the association committed to improving its internal approval process so no future construction project could move forward without documented verification of every required property right. Their insurance carrier helped resolve the financial claims, allowing compensation for the unauthorized use without placing the entire burden on individual families who had purchased their homes in good faith. 2 board members resigned shortly afterward. According to several residents, they admitted they had relied on assumptions instead of demanding complete documentation before approving the original project. I never celebrated their resignations. Losing the trust of your neighbors is punishment enough. A few weeks later, I was repairing an old bulldozer engine when I noticed someone pulling into my driveway. It was Frank, the homeowner I'd met weeks earlier. He climbed out of his truck, looked around my grandfather's old property, and smiled. "You know," he said, I drove past this place for years without ever wondering who built it. I laughed and told him most people never did. We stood there talking for almost an hour, not about lawsuits or pipelines, but about Wyoming winters, old ranches, and how quickly communities change. Before leaving, he looked back at the farmhouse and said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Sometimes the oldest house on the road ends up teaching the newest neighborhood its biggest lesson. After everything settled down, life became surprisingly ordinary again. I still wake up before sunrise. I still spend my days rebuilding engines with grease on my hands. The garage still smells like diesel fuel and cut steel, and every now and then I catch myself hearing my grandfather's voice when I'm walking the fence line. The biggest difference isn't the agreement we signed or the compensation that came with it. It's the peace of mind that comes from knowing his wishes were respected. He didn't spend a lifetime protecting that land so someone else could quietly decide its value for him. He believed ownership carried responsibility, and responsibility worked both ways. Looking back now, I don't think this story is really about natural gas or legal documents. It's about something much simpler. Respect. Respect for boundaries. Respect for promises. Respect for the idea that no matter how large a company becomes or how expensive a neighborhood looks, the rules should apply the same way to everyone. If somebody had knocked on my door years earlier, introduced themselves, and asked for permission, this entire story might have ended over a handshake and a cup of coffee. Instead, it ended after months of lawyers, engineers, surveys, and difficult conversations that never should have been necessary. Maybe that's the real cost of taking shortcuts. So now I'd like to hear what you think. If you discovered that someone had been using part of your property without permission for years, would you have pushed for the same kind of legal resolution, or would you have handled it differently? Where do you think the line is between protecting your rights and finding a fair outcome for everyone involved? Share your thoughts in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious how other people would see this situation. And if you enjoy stories about property disputes, small-town conflicts, and real-world legal battles where patience matters more than revenge, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around, because sometimes the quietest people end up with the most unbelievable stories.